In the dense green silence of the Yucatan lowlands, where the air hangs thick with heat and the jungle never truly sleeps, the Maya built a world that still refuses to be forgotten. They raised cities from limestone and limestone alone, carving civilization out of a landscape that offered no rivers broad enough for easy trade, no metals to forge tools, and no beasts of burden to haul the weight of their ambitions. Everything they created, every pyramid, every palace, every crumbling wall still strangled by roots, was built by human hands, human backs, and human will. And yet not every hand that built those walls would ever be permitted to walk through the doorways they carved. This was a civilization that knew, with absolute clarity, the difference between those who ruled and those who served. And nowhere was that difference written more plainly than in stone. The Maya world was not one city, but hundreds, a sprawling constellation of city-states spread across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. At its height, between roughly 250 and 900 CE, the period scholars call the Classic Era, the Maya population numbered in the millions. Tikal, one of the mightiest of these cities, may have housed more than 100,000 souls within its hinterland. Palenque rose from the mist-covered hills of Chiapas like a dream carved in jade. Copan, far to the south in modern Honduras, was renowned for its extraordinary sculptural tradition, its stelae so finely worked that scholars would one day compare them to the finest achievements of any ancient culture on earth. But beyond the temples and the royal courts, beyond the towering pyramid complexes and the elaborately painted tomb chambers, lived an entirely different Maya world. The world of the farmer, the potter, the weaver, the mason who built the very monuments he would never inhabit. To understand what separated these two worlds, one must first understand the material they shared. Limestone. The Yucatan Peninsula sits atop one of the largest limestone shelves on Earth, and the Maya built almost everything from it. Limestone could be quarried in great blocks, shaped with stone tools, and crucially, burned and ground into a plaster called sascab, a fine white stucco that the Maya applied to nearly every surface they wished to elevate. It was malleable when wet, hard as iron when dry, and capable of holding pigment in brilliant shades of red, the blue, yellow, and black. In the hands of elite craftsmen, it became the medium for faces of gods, the contours of kings, the intricate glyphs of royal lineage stretching back into mythological time. In the hands of a common builder working on a peasant dwelling, it was simply the stuff that filled the gaps. The homes of Maya commoners were not built to endure the centuries. They were not meant to. The typical house of a farmer or artisan was a perishable structure built on a low stone or earthen platform to lift the floor above seasonal flooding and the crawling damp of the jungle floor. The walls were most often made of wattle, thin branches woven together into a lattice framework, and then packed with clay or daubed with mud. The roof was thatched with palm fronds, grasses, or the leaves of the cohewn palm, or laid in overlapping layers thick enough to shed the torrential rains of the wet season. When that thatch rotted, as it did quickly in tropical heat, it was stripped and replaced. When the wattle walls crumbled or warped, they were patched or rebuilt. These were living structures in the truest sense, constantly tended and constantly renewed, and they left almost nothing behind for archaeologists to study. What survives from the commoner's world is largely the platform itself, the low stone foundation, rarely more than half a meter in height, upon which the perishable superstructure once stood. Excavations of these platforms across the Maya lowlands reveal a remarkably consistent domestic pattern. A single family compound typically consisted of 3 to 5 small structures arranged around a central patio. A main sleeping house, a separate kitchen structure where the hearth burned continuously, and 1 or 2 smaller outbuildings that may have served as storage spaces, workshops, or sleeping quarters for extended family members. The patio between them was the heart of daily life. A swept, packed earth surface where food was prepared, children played, tools were maintained, and the dead were sometimes buried beneath the floor of the home itself, in shallow graves that kept the ancestors close to the living. The interior of a commoner's home was Spartan. Sleeping was done on low wooden benches or on reed mats, spread directly on the earthen floor. There was no separate room for sleeping, no hall for receiving guests, no chamber for storage or ceremony. Everything happened in the same compressed space: eating, sleeping, grinding corn on the metate, on nursing children, sheltering from the storm. The smoke from the cooking fire had no chimney and hung in the upper reaches of the thatch roof, darkening the fronds and deterring insects. Light came from within or from without. There was no middle ground. Yet to look at these remains and see only poverty is to misread the Maya commoner's world entirely. The platforms, though humble in height, were often carefully constructed with rubble fill and stone facing. Middens, the ancient refuse heaps that are an archaeologist's greatest treasure, reveal that many commoner households possessed painted ceramic vessels of real quality, obsidian blades traded from distant highland sources, and jade beads acquired through exchange networks stretching hundreds of miles. The Maya commoner was not isolated from the larger civilization. He was embedded in it, contributing through labor and tribute, and receiving its material culture in return. But there was a line, and that line was drawn in limestone, mortar, and the ambitions of kings. The palace complexes and pyramid temples of the Maya elite exist in a category of construction that feels, even today, almost incomprehensible in its scale and sophistication. At Tikal, the Great Temple One, the Temple of the Great Jaguar, rises more than 47 meters above the plaza floor, a 9-tiered pyramid crowned with a steep roof temple chamber that archaeologists call a roof comb, a soaring lattice structure of stone that once bore painted stucco images of the ruler enthroned and triumphant. It was built above the tomb of Jasaw Chan Kawil I, one of Tikal's most celebrated kings, who died around 734 CE and was interred in a vaulted burial chamber deep within the pyramid's core, surrounded by jade ornaments, carved bones, painted ceramics, and the remains of sacrificed individuals whose purpose in death was to serve him in whatever came after. The construction of such a pyramid required an engineering intelligence that modern observers still struggle to fully appreciate. The Maya had no iron tools, no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals. Every stone was quarried by hand using harder stone and wooden wedges, then transported on wooden rollers or carried on the backs of men along the Sakbiab, the white roads the Maya built across the jungle, slightly elevated and surfaced with compacted limestone, stretching in some cases for dozens of kilometers between cities. The logistics of feeding, organizing, and directing the labor forces necessary for a major construction project implied a level of administrative sophistication every bit as impressive as the architecture itself. The corbelled vault was the structural signature of elite Maya architecture. The Maya did not discover the true arch, which distributes weight through a keystone and allows for broad, open spans. Instead, they built the corbelled vault, in which successive courses of stone are each cantilevered slightly inward from both sides of a room until they meet at the top. The result is a triangular ceiling, narrow and pointed, that gives Maya interior spaces their distinctive, almost claustrophobic quality. The walls had to be enormously thick to support the inward pressure of the corbelled stones, so thick that the total mass of wall in a typical Maya palace far exceeds the total interior volume it encloses. But in the hands of skilled builders working on royal commissions, the corbelled vault was elevated into something breathtaking. The interior rooms of the palace at Palenque, that extraordinary compound of towers, galleries, and subterranean passages set against the Chiapas hills, are faced with the finest white stucco, their walls once alive with painted figures and hieroglyphic texts. The doorways were framed with carved limestone lintels, the jams incised with scenes of rulers receiving captives, standing in communion with supernatural forces, or being dressed in the regalia of divine kingship. Every surface was intentional. Every carving served a purpose, not merely decorative, but political, religious, cosmological, announcing to anyone who moved through those spaces the absolute authority of the dynasty that had built them. The contrast with commoner construction was not merely aesthetic, it was structural, spiritual, and deeply deliberate. Elite buildings were built on high platforms precisely to elevate the ruler, literally and symbolically, above the ground level of ordinary life. To approach a king in his palace, one climbed. To enter a temple, one climbed again. Height was power made visible. The platform of a royal palace might rise 10, 15, or 20 meters above the surrounding plaza, a stone mountain that transformed the ruler into a figure between worlds, neither fully terrestrial nor fully divine, but occupying the liminal space where the two touched. The materials themselves were markers of status. Commoner platforms were built from roughly dressed rubble, given a minimal coat of plaster if plastered at all. Elite architecture used finely cut limestone blocks laid in regular courses with joints so tight that in many cases a blade cannot be inserted between them. The plaster covering elite structures was not the functional sascab of the commoner's floor, but a polished, burnished material of extraordinary whiteness, applied in multiple layers and painted with mineral pigments. A newly completed Maya palace was not gray-brown stone. It was blinding white, with friezes of red, blue, and green visible across the plaza and beyond, a beacon of power, legible through the jungle canopy for miles. The spatial organization of elite compounds further underscored the social logic of Maya civilization. Royal palaces were not single buildings, but sprawling complexes of interconnected ranges, courtyards, and enclosed spaces, each zone more restricted than the last. The outer plazas were public, great paved expanses where the mass rituals of the Maya calendar were performed, where war captives were displayed, where the population of a city might gather to witness the pageantry of royal power. Moving deeper, access became increasingly restricted until the innermost chambers, the sleeping rooms of the ruler, the private sanctuaries of the royal family, were accessible only to those of the highest rank. What makes the architectural contrast of the Maya world so haunting, so historically resonant, is the understanding that it was not simply the product of wealth, it was the product of ideology. The Maya did not build their pyramids and palaces merely because kings had more resources than farmers. They built them because the entire civilizational order, the religious system, the cosmological framework, the calendar, the writing, the concept of divine kingship, demanded visible, permanent expression. The pyramid was not merely a tomb or a temple. It was an argument about the nature of the cosmos, about who had the right to stand at its center, about which lives mattered enough to be written in stone. And the commoner's thatch-roofed house on its low platform, surrounded by the patio where children played and corn was ground and the dead lay beneath the floor. That, too, was an argument about survival, but about family, about the continuity of ordinary life beneath the long shadow of extraordinary power. Both arguments endure. The pyramids still rise from the jungle floor, drawing the eyes of visitors who arrive from across the modern world to stand at the base of something they can barely comprehend. And in the low mounds barely visible beneath the undergrowth that surround every great Maya site, the house platforms of the thousands who built those temples and fed those courts and carried those stones. The other Maya world persists as well, quieter, less visited, but no less real. In the silence between the monuments and the mounds, the full truth of what the Maya created comes into focus at last. A civilization of extraordinary brilliance, built upon a foundation of absolute and unforgiving inequality. Whose stones, the cut and the rough, the whitened and the plain, the towering and the low, still speak to anyone willing to listen,